So this entire sermon is going to be helpful for you to know is predicated on the assumption that humanity is created in the image of God, and that God knew what he was doing when he wired you together, right? When you were created, when you came to be. And I say that because I think it's helpful for you to know that this theme we're going to come back to throughout the sermon, I think throughout our exploration of these verses in Matthew 25. Now, having said that, I don't necessarily assume that everybody here believes that, or at least even believes that in the way that I believe it or that others believe it. It's something that maybe we would disagree on the finer nuances of. But I think it's helpful for you to know that I think this entire chapter is meant to be read with that in the background of your mind and your heart and your being, that humanity is created in the image of God, and that God knew what he was doing when he wired you, knit you together. The French writer Voltaire famously said, probably not in English, but in French, "In the beginning, God created man in his own image, and man has been trying to repay the favor ever since." Humanity has been trying to repay the favor, trying to recreate God in our own image ever since, right? This is, among other things, I think what is true about humanity. And this is true whether you are or call yourself a follower of Jesus or not, that we are good at creating an image of God that aligns perfectly with our own thoughts and our own desires and our own hopes and our own fears and wants and wishes, political ideology, financial spending, philosophy, all of it, like more, much, much more. The way we think about the world, the way we interact with the world, in all of our living and moving and being. We have become very good at creating an image of God that only ever encourages me to do the things that I would want to do. And so you can call it God or you can call it self. I think the reality is that if who or what we claim is God doesn't challenge the way we live and the way we think, then we probably aren't really worshiping God at all, but just an image or a version of ourselves. And I think instead Christianity tells the story of a God who creates, of a humanity of people who are created in the image of God with a purpose and for a reason, and who are called into something, not necessarily because we like it, but because it is right and because it is good. In the very first chapter of the very first book in the Bible, Genesis, if you want to find it, you don't need to. Later, you can go back and read it. Paints a picture of a God who does create, a God who speaks things into being, and they are good. It's this repetition. They are good. It was good. He saw that it was good. When humanity is created, the very first thing that they're given is a task. They're called into a way of being that in many ways mimics God's way of being. The first task that they are given is to create, to work, to name the living things, to take care of what God has entrusted to them. A God who is a creative, loving, working God creates humanity in that same image. One who creates and who works with what has been entrusted to them. And so in Matthew 25, we jump in. The first verse for us, which is verse 14, just begins like this. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey. This is Jesus teaching. He teaches, as Jesus often does, in parables with stories and vivid imagery. And it begins, it is like a man. It will be like a man going on a journey. The it that Jesus is referring to here is the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God will be like this. Jesus is giving a picture to the disciples, and I think to us, about what it will be like for the kingdom of God to come, and for the kingdom of God to come now, and as we've talked about, in its final measure, in its fullest measure. What will that day look like? Jesus says that day, that kingdom of God that the Messiah is called to bring into being on earth will be like a man going away on a journey. A couple weeks ago, I had a 10-day stretch where I performed 2 funerals and 1 wedding. I think there's a book of the same name and maybe a movie, and I'm not recommending them because I've never read them or seen it. But it's a privilege as a pastor to do both of these life events for people. But it's also a stark and contrasting image of some of the things that life has to offer, right? Whenever I perform a wedding, it's a great celebration. I've been lucky. All of the weddings I've been a part of have become great celebrations. Like, right, haven't gone sideways. They've all been married. It's been a success in those just strictest measure of a wedding. But every time I do a wedding, I'm reminded of the reality that life is full of these beginnings, these moments of beginning and of newness. Right? And so much of the way that we talk about the kingdom of God is being called into a new way of being, into new life. Into life to its fullest measure. And so whenever I'm at a wedding, I go, hey, isn't it great that God calls us into these moments where we are becoming something new? And we are called into this new life that he has for us. And every time I perform a funeral, which admittedly is more often these days, I'm reminded that life has an end. At least an end in or to one shape and form that we experience it. And like, listen, if nobody's told you recently, you will die. There will be a day. And what matters, it does matter, what you do in between today and the new beginnings that God calls you into and continues to call you into, and that day. It's a great way to think about life and how you are called to engage with the church and with one another. So I want to ask you a question. How many of you feel like in this life, because some of you, all of you, are between beginning and an ending in one shape? How many of you in the middle, in the meantime, feel like at this moment you can say, I have arrived. I've made it. I've made it. Nobody is putting up their hand, which I'm very grateful for because it's not the direction I thought it would go. So this is great. Right? Like your life equals big success, right? Monumental success. And maybe part of you feels that, and that's great. We would celebrate that with you. But chances are, like many of us or most of us, you feel like you haven't, right? You feel like you haven't fully made it. Maybe you have a picture of what it would or could or should look like to feel like you've made it, like you've arrived. Right? Maybe the picture you have is of graduating from a particular program or a particular level of education, and either you're thinking, when I hit that mark, then I will have made it. Or maybe you're looking back and you're like, I thought that would be it. I guess it's not. And so maybe looking forward, it's a particular job. Maybe it's your first real job. Maybe it's getting married, or maybe it's having kids, or maybe it's becoming empty nesters. Maybe it is having grandkids. Maybe it's retirement. Maybe it's going back to work because retirement made you, quote, a little crazy, according to your spouse, right? Maybe it was second retirement. You're like, okay, let's try it again. Maybe it's having great grandkids, right? Chances are, I think, that many of us don't ever really feel like we've made it. Not like we've arrived. One of the biggest and most common understandings about Christians by people who claim to be non-Christians is that we are a bunch of people who think we've made it, who think like we've arrived, like life is perfect as it can be. But you know that that's not the case. The beautiful thing about the Christian life, and if nobody's ever told you this, like I hope you find this encouraging and a little bit challenging, is that it's never over. There is not a day in your relationship with Jesus and in following God and in pursuing community and in doing work in the world. Like there is not a day where you go, I've done everything there is to do. I've arrived. I've made it. I've succeeded. There is always something that you're being called into. There's always something that God is calling you to do. That life is never really over. Walking a life out with Jesus is a journey. And it is one that lasts and hopefully lasts the entirety of your life and beyond, into the new heaven and into the new earth. But I think what Jesus is going to say is that what you do now does matter. What you do before you leave this rock matters. It's important. So Jesus says, again, the kingdom of heaven, the picture that he wants you to have is of a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To the one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. And if you're underlining in a Bible, even if it's the church Bible, underline 2 things. Entrusted his wealth to them. That's one thing. Underline and circle. And then the next is each according to his ability. And then it says he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once, put his money to work, and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag of gold gained nothing. He dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. He was afraid, it says. Like I said, I want you to notice one line, maybe above all the others at this moment. And that is that line that says, he called his servants to him, and he entrusted his wealth to them, each according to their ability. When I was a kid, I wanted a Palm Pilot. How many of you wanted a Palm Pilot as a kid? How many of you remember what a Palm Pilot is? Okay, all right. At least we've got that. Okay. I wanted a Palm Pilot. I don't know. I thought it was cool. It was before the days of iPhones, like where you had supercomputers in your back pocket. It was like the thing. And I don't know if it was the thing. In my mind, it was like the picture. I was like, this is cool. If you have one of these things, you're cool. Chances are, if you had, I'm not even going to go there. But I wanted one. And my dad had a Palm Pilot. And then he was getting a new Palm Pilot. And I said to myself, Grant, this is your moment. This is great. This is that moment where you're going to get a Palm Pilot. And so I went to my dad and I said, hey, Dad, can you give me your old Palm Pilot? And he said, yeah, no way. And so I just kept asking him, hey, Dad, how about I borrow it? Can I borrow it? And so he's like, well, let me think about it. He came back to me. He's like, all right, I've thought about it. And it's not yours. But here, you can have this Palm Pilot. I'm entrusting it to you. You may use it. It's still mine. It's not yours. But you can. There are like clear parameters here, okay? And I took that thing to school first day, and what do you think I did? Oh, I lost it. That would have been better. I broke it. Smashed the screen completely. I can't remember what happened. Fell in my pocket, or I fell on top of it. I don't know. Probably both. It smashed the screen. I took it home that first day, and I was like, my life is over. I don't know what I'm going to do. Right? Smash the screen. Was it on purpose? No, absolutely not. Could it have been prevented? Probably. Yep. Chances are it could have. Did I feel horrible? Absolutely. I've been given this thing. It had been entrusted to me. It had value and purpose, and I was meant to use it, and I clearly wasn't responsible enough to take care of it. According to my ability, I was meant to take care of it. I was thought to have the ability to take care of it, and I didn't. And I think what this parable encourages you and challenges you in is the reality that in creating you, in wiring you, God has entrusted you with pieces of the kingdom, right? With pieces of who God is, of who Jesus is, to take into the world and to represent toward the world and to others, to one another. God has entrusted you with something. He's entrusted you with resources because of the way he's wired you, because of the way he's created you, according to your ability. And now listen, I know, according to your ability, that might sound harsh. You go, okay, well, what's my ability? That sounds a little strange. I thought don't we all have the same ability? Isn't Jesus going to, play with us all on even playing fields? Right, accordingly, each to their, or according to their ability. Might sound harsh, but it is just the way things are. We've recently started paying Anna and Evie for some of the work they do around the house. And not the standard, you belong to this family chore, okay? So, don't listen. There are those things, you belong to this family, and together as a family, we each have things to do, okay? Not those chores, not those things that they do, but, the above and beyond chores. The chores that Dad does not want to do anymore, and so I'm willing to pay them a little bit of money to do. This is scooping poop in the backyard, right? Going around with the little, pooper scooper. This is Anna's new job. And picking up poop. And so we pay them for those over and above, okay? So don't get any ideas, kids, grandkids, over and above chores, all right? And this is how it usually happens, right? We have these conversations nightly, weekly, weekend especially. We're sitting around the dinner table, eating, talking about what we need to do, what we need to accomplish as a family, whether it's that evening or like over the next few days, for the weekend, before we do something, if we're going somewhere, like this is all what we need to do, and who wants to do this, and how are we going to work together to get it done. And sometimes those conversations go great, and sometimes they don't. But it usually happens. Anna pipes up, and she's like, hey, Dad, like, are we going to get paid for these jobs? Are we going to get money for these jobs? And so we got to go backtrack, right? Be like, okay, so like here, these are the jobs that we know we don't get paid for. These are the jobs that everybody needs to do. And then if you finish all of those, here are the next set of jobs that you can do, which usually number one's go scoop poop. And so like we've got her motivated. She loves it. She recently went to Chapters. We took her to Chapters, and she was able to take her money to Chapters with her, and she bought herself some chapter books. She bought a series of books. And she's working her way through it. So I'm like, okay, great. She knows the value of a dollar and also a poop scoop. She knows. She's connected those things in her mind. And we've got her motivated. And so she's asking. She's like, okay, listen, if I want to buy another book, I know exactly what I need to do. And she backs it up. Evie, on the other hand, she's wily, like smart, like almost dangerously so. And so she sits in those conversations and recently sat in this conversation. She's listened. She's watching the whole thing. She's like, Dad's going to pay for this stuff anyways. This is what is going on in her little 3-year-old brain. Why would I scoop poop to get Dad's money if they're just going to pay for it anyways? Like I'm not going to do it. So she pipes up and she's like, Dad, I don't want money. I don't need money. I don't. So I don't need to do any of the chores, right? Like she's like, all right, okay, here we go. And so I turned to her that night and I listened. The jury's out on whether this is a good parenting move or not. And so I turned to her and I was like, okay, I'll pay you in candy. And she's like, I'm in. I had her, done. Each according to their own ability. It's not the same. It is not the same with those two kids, and it's not the same with you. Each of us, according to the way God has wired you at this particular moment of your life, with the abilities you have, with the gifts you have, with the resources you have, God is calling you into something, and he is equipping you for something, and he's giving you resources to do that thing because he knows you best. Each according to their own ability. The master leaves the house, and he takes his wealth, and to some, it says, to one he gave 5, and to some, here you go, he gave 1. Sorry, right? And 1. And he hands these out. Sorry, Ben, I don't know how the video is going to look on that one there. And he goes, and he says, and to the first he gives 5, and then he gives 3, and then 1, or 2, and 1, and listen, God knows the way that you've been wired, and he gives it to you according. He knows what they are what you are capable of. But then it goes, he went away. He entrusted his wealth to them, and then he goes away. God has entrusted you with something, and he's given you unique gifts to be faithful with the thing that he has entrusted you to use. And I think what ends up happening, one of the quickest things that we do, is that we begin to look around and compare the things that we've been given. And so we go, okay, well, he got 1 bag, that's great. She got 7 over there, right? Maybe one of us gets like 1 or 2 little coins, and we don't want to talk about it. And we're like, well, I'm not going to talk about it because that's private, right? That's private. That's my business and not your business. But then except what also happens is like, well, this person over there, they just don't want to stop talking about it. They can't talk enough about all the things that God has given them. And we look around and we start to think and we start to compare ourselves to one another. I say, well, God maybe hasn't, why hasn't God given me as much? Why do I have more than that person over there? And some of that is good, man. If that calls you to go, okay, what should I do with what I've been given? That's great. But I think what ends up happening instead is that it starts to speak to who we are and how you perceive yourself and how you view yourself and how you think God views you. Henri Nouwen in Bread for the Journey, which is a brilliant little book of devotionals. If you want something daily to be reading, like that's a great book to be reading. Henri Nouwen writes this. He said, "We will never find our vocations." Vocations is the word that Christians have used for centuries to talk about the thing that God has created you to do, the thing that you are wired to do, the thing that God has gifted you to do, the thing that you have passion for, the thing that gets you up in the morning, where those things intersect, where what God has given you gifts to do and to live into, and where the world needs your gifts and where you have passion and energy, like when those things come together, that's what we call vocation. And Henri Nouwen says you're never going to find that thing that you're called to do. You're never going to find that by trying to figure out whether you are better or worse than others. He goes on to say, he says, we are good enough to do what we are called to do. So be yourself. You are good enough to do what God has called you to do. One of the things that you need to figure out is what that thing is. What has God called you to do? What's he wired you to do? How are you going to use what you've been given to help build the kingdom? Because the story doesn't just end, right, with that question hanging in the air. It ends when the master returns. And this is what Jesus says the kingdom of heaven will be like. And what the Gospels point us toward and what the early church has believed and taught for now centuries, what for generation after generation we have believed is that we live in between Jesus existing, living, breathing, eating, teaching, sitting with people, dying and being brought back to life, and his coming again. In between that moment, waiting for that moment, looking toward, pointing our lives, orienting what we do toward that moment. And Jesus says, when that time comes, after a long time, in verse 19, it says, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness, or some versions say, I think this is a better translation, come and share in your master's joy. Highlight that. The man who had 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come share in your master's happiness, joy. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid. And I went out and I hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. I was afraid. This is why the image that you have of who God is matters so much to how you live your life and how you feel your way through life. Here's a servant who has a particular view of who his master is and how his master deals or will potentially deal with him. He says, so I was afraid. He's like, I knew you're harsh. You're a harsh man. I was afraid of what that could mean. And so I went out and I hid your gold. And he brings back exactly what he was given. No more, no less. His master replies like this. Then his master replied, you wicked and lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with bankers, so that when I had returned, it's like, at least, right, I would have received it back with interest. Now the reality is this parable does get misused a lot. This isn't a parable about earning your salvation. This isn't a parable of Jesus' return and saying, well, you should have believed more. You should have had a little bit more faith. Like, it was on you. Like, this isn't a parable about earning the approval of God. This isn't about earning as much money as you can. It's not even a parable about earning as much money as you can just so that you can give it all away. It's a parable at the end of the day about living inside of the kingdom and recognizing that all that you have, all that we are, is a gift from God, meant to be used. The first 2 servants, they recognize that they hadn't earned what they were given. It was a gift. It was never theirs to possess. It was entrusted to them for a reason, for a purpose to be used. And so what ends up happening is they hold on to it with open hands, not afraid that it might get used, but because they know it is a gift to be used. But the third one, right, the third man, he's afraid. And what do we do when we're afraid? We close our hands. And we tighten our fists. And we hold on to what we have. Because good grief, if I make one misstep, I'm going to lose it all. And so he goes and he hides it. We try to possess what we have. We try to keep it safe. We stick it in our pockets. And we hide it. Right? That man, I think he realized, or he thinks he realizes the trick in it all. Like, this is a zero-sum game. Right? So he's only got so much to give out. I've only got so much to lose. Right? This can only be lost. It can only be used up or lost. Like, there's no good outcome here. What if I'm not successful? And I think he becomes paralyzed with fear. And he doesn't do anything. And I wonder, how many times have I become paralyzed by fear? How many times have you been afraid because of what God has entrusted to you? Or because of what God has called you to do? How often have we acted out of fear of losing what was never really ours to begin with? See, I think what really matters is how you view what you've been given. Be faithful with what you have been given, because it doesn't belong to you in the end. It's never yours. It is a gift from God. One of the best things I heard about parenting before I had kids came from a friend of ours who, when Connie asked a simple question, how do you do it? How do you raise such loving and kind kids? This lady simply responded by saying, I realized early on that they were never ours to begin with. They were God's. They were entrusted to us. How you view what God has given you matters. And it does change the way you live. Be it gifts and abilities, be it talents, the things that you are good at, be it financial resources and an ability to give and to do and to support in ways not many people have. If they're yours, you're going to close your hands. And you're going to hold tightly to them in an attempt to hold on to them forever. But if they're God's, you're going to learn to live with open hands, ready to be generous, because you trust a God who's been generous with you. The last thing, this is how I want to close, is by looking at the master's response to the first two servants, because he says, and I'm just going to hop back into 23, it says, his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. That could be its whole other sermon on its own. I want you to hear this last piece. Come and share your master's happiness. Come and share in your master's joy, because happiness, it falls short of what Jesus is saying. He's not saying that you're going to experience this like emotional happiness or relational happiness as a reward of doing good things. The master invites his servants to share in his joy in who he is, to participate in the joy that belongs only to the master. Again, as a gift. Joy is a gift. And joy is living unafraid. Joy is the ability to receive without fear and without trepidation, as Stanley Hauerwas says, is to be able to embrace what you've been given without fear. Joy is the ability to live into being a follower of Jesus who is generous. I think joy is for the follower of Jesus, experienced when you receive grace, which is a gift only from God.